So this slide presentation is a brief overview of Bardach's Eightfold Path and policy analysis as a profession. We're looking at ideas from several different books, particularly the books by Munger and Mintram that I mentioned in the video, but also we should be looking particularly at the Bardach textbook that we're using in this course. So a common question we ask is, what is policy analysis? Munger tells us that policy analysis is as old as policy itself. If policy is a course of methods selected from amongst alternatives to guide and determine future conditions, then it stands to reason that a detailed examination made in order to understand its features and how it's working is necessary. So in other words, we're looking at public policy in determining which policies work best given the concerns and problems that society is facing. And somebody has to do it, right? And at least some of us in class might decide that it should be us. One approach to policy analysis is that of John Kingdon. John Kingdon came up with what's called the three streams model: problems, policy alternatives, and politics. He first started working with this idea in the 1980s, but continued it throughout the rest of his career. The book that I originally learned on was the 1995 of his edition of his Agendas, Alternatives, and Public Policies. In order for policies to be adopted, they first must be considered, and Kingdon's focus was on how policies reach the public agenda. The public agenda being the agenda of government and the people who are trying to influence government. So this is a recognition that there is a policy problem that's worth being solved by government action, that there are alternatives that can actually solve the problem, that they're technically feasible, and that there's political will, or what we often call political feasibility, for solving the problem. Now, it would be nice to believe that when we decide to solve a policy problem, that we gather all of the information and find every possible alternative that could work to solve the problem, and then we analyze them one by one to determine which would be best. Kingdon's approach, though, is broadly consistent with what Cohen, March, and Olson called their garbage can model. So while policy analysis will try to present the world in a way that says that we're rational and comprehensive and we've looked at everything and these are the best alternatives, that actual policy making operates in organized anarchy. These were what Cohen, March, and Olson said. We're going to look at the article that Cohen, March, and Olson first used to illustrate this, or first propounded this view of how policy making occurs. But in essence, when the decision is made, the alternatives that are readily available are chosen. We choose from between them. And the chief justification of policy analysis is to force the ideas derived through organized anarchy to survive a true evaluative test. Absent that, we start to get things like Stone would suggest, right? And it's just who has the political power and the political resources to accomplish what they hope to. Policy analysts are often in the business of saying, well, yes, this is what we'd like to do. Can we do it? Munger suggested that there's 5 steps in policy analysis. One would be problem formulation. Sometimes we call this problem definition or problem identification. Next, we have the selection of criteria, followed by comparison of alternatives and selection of the policy, consideration of political and organizational constraints, and then finally implementation and evaluation. You're going to see that there's a broad similarity between what Munger says here and what we talked about in the elements of a good policy paper. After all, a good policy paper is telling the world what we did when we conducted good policy analysis. Now, problem formulation is often difficult to define. We sometimes focus on symptoms, and if you really want to solve a problem, perhaps you should focus instead on causes. Some alternatives are advantaged by how the problems are framed. Every semester I have a student who will come up with an alternative that he really wants to see adopted, and then he'll say that the problem is that we haven't adopted that policy. Well, that's not really an ideal way to solve problems, right? If you say that your goal is to put out fires by using wet blankets, then finding a wet blanket will always be an element of the solution. However, it might be better to use water. It might be better to use flame retardant materials. It's, if you decide what the answer is as part of the question, then you're not going to get the best possible answer to what maybe is the better question. Stone will show that by defining the problem, you actually do create decisions almost inevitably. Munger doesn't entirely disagree, but I think Bardach would tell us that to whatever extent we can avoid determining our answer by how we ask the question, we create better policy. So the selection of criteria is perhaps the most important element, right? Criteria should focus on the ends, on the outcome, on what is the solved problem, not the means. Again, if one of your criteria is how well you can make a wet blanket work to put out a fire, or how many blankets are being used to put out the fire, you aren't necessarily asking, right? There's the joke about, when you're waist deep in alligators, you forget that you were trying to drain the swamp. Well, if protecting yourself from alligators is the alternative, or getting into the swamp is part of the criteria, then you're definitely not doing the best you can in swamp draining. Alternatives are the means. And so if you say, I want Carl Snook to teach me particle physics, your alternatives will be narrowed, right? You are not going to get the best possible lesson in particle physics. You'll get one. I know a little bit about particle physics, but I bet you could get a better lesson. Each criterion must be clearly and precisely stated. The better you do at this, the more meaningful the result you actually come up with. You should quantify the criteria if you can. The set of criteria should be complete. They should account for all concerns. Anybody's concerns that you leave out, well, to whatever extent that person is able to make a nuisance of themselves, it will harm your ability to sell your alternative. Criteria should be mutually exclusive so as not to count a single concern twice. So, if your concern is both wanting your grass not to die and in addition to have to mow the lawn, you've accidentally said that you want your grass not to die twice. A good way to organize policy analysis is by using what's called a criteria alternatives matrix. You actually don't see this on table 1.1 on page 10. I'm sorry about that. But I will be later in the semester posting a criteria alternatives matrix that you might be able to use. But in essence, what you're doing is you're looking at each possible criteria, each criterion, and then you are looking at each alternative, and you're filling in the boxes in the matrix of how does each alternative do for each criterion. A lot of times people forget that a possible alternative that you could select is the status quo. You might decide that the best possible thing to do is nothing. However, you should have at least two alternatives, right? If your only alternative is the status quo, or the only alternative is the plan that you hope to adopt, then you will, well, if you only offer one alternative, it'll be what has to be selected. Ideally, you're going to have the status quo, you're going to have your favorite alternative, and then you should have a competing alternative. If the more things that you take into account, the more meaningful it is when you decide the alternative that you desire. Often decision makers will attempt to limit alternatives to those that leave their favorite alternative as the best option. But, you know, if we're to criticize that and to say that we're a profession that is trying to uncover what is best, then we'll leave to the politicians to do that. And as with the criteria, alternatives should present as comprehensive a list as is possible. Now, Bardach expands on this approach, and he actually lists 8 steps, or the eightfold path to policy analysis. Define the problem, assemble some evidence, construct the alternatives, select the criteria, project the outcomes, which is much of what the criteria alternatives matrix would do. Confront the trade-offs. You know, what are you losing in order to get one alternative over another? Sometimes you're paying more in order to get a better outcome. Sometimes you are choosing a worse outcome for one person in order that someone else would succeed, right? When you're telling when you're telling somebody to, you know, go and capture a snake and to take it out of the garage, the reason, you know, you're inconveniencing at least the guy who's supposed to go do that. But it is probably better for everyone to do that. You put one person in charge because maybe he's good at it. But certainly, you know, he might say, well, what am I getting in return? Then you should stop, focus, narrow, deepen, and decide, which is to say, actually try to understand everything that's going on, including the mechanisms behind why some alternatives might be more successful than others. And then choose the alternative that's best. And then something that we mentioned in the elements of a good policy paper is that you aren't actually conducting your policy research as you write. You actually tell the story after the research is over. How many times am I going to say actually? So you tell your story. You convince people that the policy analysis you did was complete and was strong, and that you really have selected the best option. So Munger's approach is more suggestive of a policy paper, and Bardach is telling you more about what you should actually be doing in terms of policy analysis. Bardach is showing the scaffolding that's usually removed to make a paper easier for the reader to follow. It might be that when you are actually writing the paper, you're not going to be describing how you deepened your understanding. You're not going to necessarily be mentioning that we would have done this, but this particular political leader is a blockhead, so we decided not to do this. But understanding what the political leader, that he is a blockhead, might be particularly useful as you're proposing a policy that you're hoping that that blockhead is going to vote for. So anyway, Bardach is teaching you how to do policy analysis, and the approach from the earlier earlier slide presentation and from what Munger said at the beginning of this slide presentation is telling you how you should be writing it up. We will look at each of these steps one by one. Now, that is not a substitute for actually reading the book. The Bardach book is particularly useful, and I strongly recommend it. Now, step one, defining the problem, is probably the most important part. What is the problem? Are we limited to the problems that everyone recognizes? And the answer to that is no. You can always make an argument that something should be on the public agenda. If we're to look at the literature on policy analysis and on public policy, Kingdon tells us that the goal of anybody who's trying to change public policy is to elevate your problem to the public agenda. And thus, that means not everything is automatically on it. In order to justify the use of governmental resources, you need to show the problem is both worth solving and a concern that the government can and should solve. I think we focus a lot on whether government should solve a problem, and maybe we should spend a little bit more time thinking about whether that is possible. During much of 2020, there was considerable pushback against the government for its failure to come up with a solution to the coronavirus problem. But think about this. If you have a brand new disease, you probably wouldn't expect there to be a readily made vaccine. After all, when they create vaccines for the annual flu, we're looking at diseases that are very similar to ones that they've just tackled the year before or the year before that. And yet they still have only moderate effectiveness. When you look at a disease that had just crossed over to humans, we shouldn't expect to have a vaccine ready. We also shouldn't be expecting government to know and understand this disease right away. After all, it's new. However, just because you are unable at a moment in time to solve a problem, what was the effort last year? Last year was to figure out, to spend an awful lot of money to try to develop a vaccine. And whatever else can be said about the vaccine, it's amazing how quickly they were able to develop one. Wherever possible, when you're trying to illustrate a problem, you're trying to bring a problem to the public agenda, what you need to do is you need to quantify it. You need to evaluate the risks and opportunities. You need to be able to compare the problem to what it would be like if there was less of a problem. How do we fix it? I talked an awful lot in this course about what does a solved problem, what does fixed look like, I say. Well, we don't know what fixed looks like unless we have something that we can compare it to. And quantification is particularly useful. For instance, if we look at homelessness, it's unlikely, I would suggest, that a time will come where people both have some semblance of freedom and there are zero homeless people on a given night. However, I would think that one way that you could judge homelessness would be to compare the number of people who are homeless to the number of people who should be or who your goal you set to have be homeless. If you set it at 0, that's impractical. But if you say there should be half as many, then you might hope to get to half as many, and when you do, you might want to entirely reevaluate the problem, because the number of people who you've taken off of the streets to cut the number in half might now leave a different group of people who make up a majority or a large segment of the homeless population that you can then begin to look at their problems. We do see in public policy moments where there's an opportunity to make major changes. But we also shouldn't forget that there's moments where very little change occurs, and instead what we see is an improvement of processes. You would hope and expect, for instance, that if coronavirus remains with us for 10, 20 years, that the ability to isolate the new variants and the ability to come up with treatments becomes much better. You wouldn't expect us to continue to do what we're doing now exactly. You would expect to see continuous improvement. So if we look at homelessness, is homelessness a public problem? Ostensibly, these people are not asking for a government program, right? They're saying they're homeless, please help. They're just individuals asking for help. Perhaps they would be just as happy for us to give them a place to stay or to give them some money. The irony of the picture is that in the background is a space available. But you look at this family and you say, well, how do we best help them? And I think in order to find out how to best help them, we should consider how they became homeless. Well, when is homelessness a problem? Perhaps when we decide it's a problem. Now, our next step is that we want to assemble some evidence. This is the space where, this is the place where papers often go off the rails. Why work all semester on an idea before you've determined whether your initial assumptions have some validity? I think what happens a lot of times is that you find a policy that makes sense, and you find an alternative that you like, and you say, this will solve a problem, and then you put it down, and then a week before it's due, you look at it again, and you start to do their background research, and then when you find out that you were entirely wrong, you don't have much time left. Whereas if you had found that out by reading one or two things right away, then you would have, some safety in putting it down for a moment. I think you should think first before you research. Go look for the things that you're trying to find. Just Googling a policy alternative might not be the best way to do your research. And you should review the literature. You should find other articles and other people who've tried to address this problem and see what they've done. Even if what they've done is wrong, quite often you find your idea is in the list of previously tried wrong solutions. So for step 3, you're finally going to start constructing alternatives. Now, the goal that Bardach suggests is to start comprehensive but end up focused. Start with a broad understanding of what it is you're trying to do, but then try to become as specific as possible. Think about what you would do if money were no object. Think about ways that you could construct an alternative where it perfectly solves the problem. Create a model of the world where there is a theoretically based mechanism for why alternatives will or will not work. If you don't understand why something will work, then you have to be a little bit skeptical about whether you truly understand what's going on. Eventually, though, alternatives should be detailed. Someone who did not study everything about the issue as you did should know how the alternative works well enough to transmit that knowledge using your explanation as a guide. Now, Munger and I disagree with Bardach on this. Bardach starts with the idea of saying construct your alternatives before you construct your criteria. You can obviously do either, right? If you can find any friend or any expert to justify what you're doing, including Stone, of course, you can get away with doing that. My view is that you should know what fixed looks like for a problem before you start looking for things that will fix it. However, Bardach knows a thing or two about public policy, a well-recognized expert, and he says that selecting the criteria is actually step 4. You say this needs to be done as a separate step from constructing alternatives. You need to include as an alternative whether the alternative you need to include as a criteria whether the alternative accomplished the goal. And other ideas that might concern you are efficiency, equity, liberty, justice, legality, basically the things that Stone talks about. And create metrics. The criteria should be measurable, ideally using numbers, but certainly using some way of comparison. The next step is to project outcomes, to determine what you think is going to happen. These are scores on the criteria for each alternative. You should try to create a table. Just remember I said I was going to tell you about this more later. You should try to create a table, often called a criteria alternatives matrix, where the outcomes are the boxes. The columns are the criteria, the rows are the alternatives, and the boxes are the outcomes. So when you use alternative 1, how does alternative 1 do on criteria 1? There's a box, you fill that in. What about criteria 2? What about criteria 3? Use your common sense. Obviously, you're not going to be certain about everything. You should discount your uncertainty if you can, but you should also look for problems that might emerge. Not all of the criteria are really going to be independent of each other. Sometimes you are actually making trade-offs. You're saying, I am choosing to spend more money to solve this problem more completely. Just about anybody who realizes that there's going to be trade-offs says that you need to find a way that you can compare the costs and benefits. This is a term called commensurability, where you can measure the price of or the cost of things on the same scale. And so not the only cost in terms of money is not the only possible trade-off. For instance, when you are comparing security and liberty, there's a cost in liberty sometimes in order to obtain more security. Certainly there's a cost in privacy. If, for instance, in order to gain security, we're going to have cameras in public places more. So anyway, there are many different types of trade-offs, and the financial cost is only one of these. So I like box 1-8. I think we should all look to it. But really, what we're trying to do is we're trying to narrow and deepen and decide. What another way of saying that is we need to truly understand the policy and the alternative that we're choosing. The serious options, like, obviously some of the things are not going to pass the initial look at. But once we get down to the alternatives that we're serious about, we need to have, a clear understanding of their strengths and weaknesses. And then we need to clearly spell those out for any decision makers. We need to understand the mechanism. And Bardach suggests looking at the $20 bill test. He says if two economists are walking down the street, one sees a $20 bill, and the other says, what's that? And the first one says, it's a $20 bill, and the second one says, no, it can't be a $20 bill. If it was a $20 bill, somebody would have picked it up by now. Well, that's a two-edged sword, right? If, obviously there are low, $20 bills laying around. But the other side of the coin is that, something must be wrong. If you have an idea that seemingly no one has ever thought of before, you have to really be skeptical. Ultimately, you might find that you were right, but you should start by being extremely skeptical and take it through all of the paces and try to truly understand why it would work before you just assume that every single person before you has just been foolish or greedy. Then finally, you need to tell your story. Another one of Bardach's fun little metaphors is the Grandma Bessie test. Now, we're not talking about some foolish person. You don't get to be Grandma Bessie by being a foolish, flighty, not intelligent person. Grandma Bessie is a smart person. It says if you can't justify your decision to a smart person with a lot of life experience, but not a lot of policy making experience, you need to rethink your approach. Because another name for Grandma Bessie is all the voters. You need to gauge your audience and you need to speak to the audience. And you need to give your story a logical narrative flow. The Munger approach is a good start, but you need to imagine Grandma or Uncle Frank or an 83-year-old U.S. Senator who no one wants to admit should retire is trying to follow you. And Bardach includes in pages 88 and 89 some common pitfalls. Now I'm going to leave you with a couple challenges for policy analysts. And this is something that you'll look back and you'll say, well, Snook's class was fun because I could just propose what I wanted to propose. Well, when you're working in policy analysis, you have some serious limitations. One is the conflict between loyalty to the clients and the loyalty to your own interests. If you're honest with yourself, you're going to realize that anybody that you're an agent for isn't going to necessarily want the same exact things that you want. And you have to somehow balance this. Hopefully you don't decide to balance it by saying I'm going to only do the minimum for my clients and I'm mostly going to look out for myself whenever I can get away with it. Hopefully you're going to say that you're going to be looking out for your clients as much as you can, given your own personal ethics. Client-imposed restrictions on criteria and alternatives. Sometimes your client's not going to care about something that they really should be caring about. And sometimes your client is not going to be accepting of certain alternatives that might be the best way to solve their problems or might be the most ethical way to address a policy problem. But that's not what they want to do. One would imagine that if you decide to work for the AMA, They're not going to say, well, what we really need to do is cut down on how much money doctors make. And if you work for the National Rifle Association, they're probably not going to be in favor of your plan to tax ammunition. If you don't like that, then you should probably have a different client. Conflict between the need for certainty and the need for immediate decision making. Now this is pretty obvious in a way, right? You could constantly look for more information forever. If you don't know exactly what's going to happen, you might never know exactly what's going to happen. But sometimes decisions need to be made in a timely manner, and that's always going to be a challenge for you. And then the requirements of the guild, Munger called it the guild, the profession of policy experts, or your institutional culture, will sometimes suggest types of alternatives that maybe the public wouldn't necessarily want. And then, of course, resource constraints. So there's a lot there. There's a lot for this chapter, not necessarily in terms of graded assignments, but certainly in terms of your understanding of policy analysis and the job that you're going to be doing, both in this course and if you decide in your career.